Gentlemen, what a treat to get to spend a little time together, the three of us. Do you know each other?
I don't think
Absolutely
so.
not.
Yeah, I don't think we've met. Yeah.
Then let me be the one to introduce you, Dan Tepfer. And Vincent, I want to make sure I say your name correctly.
Yes, Vincent.
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 And
Yes.
how do you pronounce your last name?
Oh, Duceau.
Duceau. Vincent
Yes.
Duceau. I thought this would be an opportunity to speak the three of us. I mean, first of all, Vincent, I think your English is better than you think it is, but I wanted you to have the safety of being able to speak in French if you wanted to. But also, as soon as you suggested the idea of having somebody who speaks French, I immediately thought of Dan, not because I think he's a good interpreter, although I'm sure he is a great interpreter, but because I thought it would also give us an opportunity to bring a third voice into this conversation. I was very curious, Vincent, about this documentary when I saw it, because you are pursuing a myth here and you find the reality. I mean, I don't want to ruin the surprise, but you discovered some truth behind the myth. And so we now have the question of how to hold these two realities, these two pieces at the same
I'm
time.
so curious about this now.
Maybe Dan, could you translate to me the last question of Leo, please? Is it possible?
I don't. What? There wasn't really a question, right, Leo? It was just you're just saying that you're interested in this question of mythology. But Vincent is saying he's also fascinated by the idea of the myth and mythology, but he feels that by trying to deconstruct the myth of the Köln concert and how Keith plays, he has only added to the legend.
Yes, that's a sign of success, I think, if you're able to contribute to the legend. Dan, can you tell me a little bit about, from your point of view, the Koln concert, which is full of mythology and particularly around the circumstances of the recording of the concert? So much has been told that Keith played a unplayable piano, that despite playing this out of tune piano and that he was exhausted, that it was a kind of a miracle. When you, as an improvising pianist, listen to this performance, are you hearing a miracle or are you hearing a musician making decisions in real time? What do you hear when you hear that record? And to what degree does the mythology serve you when you listen to it?
Wow, so many things to say about that. So first of all, I discovered the Köln concert when I was a teenager. I think I was probably 12 or 13 or something like that. It was a gift from I think my dad, if I remember correctly. And so I heard it, and this is kind of pre-internet. I mean, there was internet, but people weren't really on it. And so I heard it without any knowledge of any of that. So I listened to it without the mythology. And what I heard, and what I still hear listening to it, and actually just a few days ago, I was working with my dear friend Thomas Enko, who's a great French jazz pianist who is currently touring the Köln concert and playing it himself. He played it in Paris a few days ago. He's playing it in Brussels tomorrow. And we were working on it together a bit. So I just listened to the recording, the original recording again. So what I heard as a teenager, what I still hear today, is the magic of Keith Jarrett in every circumstance, which is this incredible capacity for concentration, this incredible capacity for an appearance transcending the craft, as in like being completely in the zone and allowing himself to go on wild flights of fancy and not restricting himself, not giving the appearance of being disciplined or anything like that, or any fear of, for example, playing a bad melody or playing or losing the time or anything like that. There's like no fear, and at the same time, never straying in terms of the basic craft of music, the time, the making good melodies, the good voice leading. And so to me, the Köln concert is no different from the other solo concerts that have been released in that it's just this miracle actually of human concentration and liberty within extreme craft. But, obviously there's something different about the Köln concert because the music is just simpler. And to me, I can tell listening to the piano that it's kind of a clunker. So it makes total sense that he'd be playing kind of honky-tonk music because the piano's a honky-tonk. I mean, that's just obvious to any musician who would listen to it. It's beyond question. Now, whether it's a miracle, no, I don't think so, because the last point I would say about this, I mean, it's a miracle. Keith's playing is a miracle. Let's be clear about that. But it is in all circumstances. The guy's an incredible genius. But it's no more a miracle than like the Vienna concert or the Paris concert, because actually, as an artist, constraint is usually helpful rather than unhelpful. It used to be a struggle for me as an improviser to have too good a piano. I just feel like I was driving a Mercedes or a Ferrari, and just like everything's possible. And I just feel like a little paralyzed by the possibilities. Whereas if I were playing a less good piano, it's like, okay, I got to figure out how to make this work. And then it just like focuses me in a certain direction. I've managed to overcome that, but it's difficult. And so Keith finds himself here in a situation where the piano is essentially telling him what to do to a certain degree. And so his options are limited. He, as the genius that he is, finds what works with his honky-tonk piano and allows himself to go in this more like honky-tonk direction. And it's brilliant, but I wouldn't say it's a miracle that he managed to transcend those possibilities. I think the only thing here that is a bit of a miracle, or is it a testament to his maturity as an artist, is that he did not say no, although I know that he was very tempted to and almost did, but he said yes and just let himself be whatever that piano required him to be in order to make music, with a big M, unrestricted with whatever intentions he had about himself or images he had of himself as an artist.
Vincent, I know Dan just said a lot, and Dan is supposed to be your translator, but he said a lot.
No, it's okay. It's okay for me. I understand better. I speak English.
So I know that the Köln concert for you is like a part of your body, that it's something that you live with and love and that you're kind of obsessed with. Dan just said something that I think is really interesting. In many terms, the Köln concert is no more a miracle than any other solo performance by Keith Jarrett that has been recorded. But there is something unique about it. Why do you think you responded so much to that recording rather than so many of the other Keith Jarrett recordings that you could have become obsessed with?
I think what truly fascinated me the most, it's partly because it was certainly the very first time I was genuinely listening to this concert is a bit of a Proustian Madeleine for me, because it was the first time I was truly put in a proper listening condition, specifically to listen to something. And when my parents told me, listen to this, you really, really have to hear this. It's certainly one of the most, I was only 6 years old. I was 6 years old, and it was the very first time I was put in a listening environment. And since I hadn't been to a concert before, this listening setting also shaped my discovery of the album naturally. And it's true that at 6, you don't always listen to what your parents say, but that time I really did. And yes, I was quite fascinated because I felt, I believe I sensed someone a little bit like someone who resembled me, in the sense that it was a child who seemed to be enjoying themselves in a certain way, but who also seemed to be suffering. And it's perhaps the first time I also felt the suffering in an adult who wasn't someone from my family. And in fact, you can hear it and you can feel it too. And that's what I liked, is that it was like this concert was like a journey. At the end of the first part, we feel he's been freed from something, and that he has finally found a way to overcome his piano's flaws, and most importantly, how to work with them. And we feel he's truly liberated from something. And this liberation, I truly experienced it firsthand, like watching a superhero saving something.
So the question was, what is it about the Köln concert in particular that stands out to Vincent among Keith's other recorded improvisations? And he has a great answer, which is it's actually very personal to him. He compared it to Proust's Madeleine, this little biscuit that he eats and that brings back this flood of memories from his childhood. So Vincent was exposed to the Köln concert as a 6-year-old by his parents, and he has a very vivid memory of, for the first time, experiencing something like a child who is playing. He felt like he could relate to Keith as a child, because Keith sounds like a child who is playing. But at the same time, he could hear Keith suffering. Keith is suffering, and then through the course of the concert, he can hear the suffering, he can hear the play, but by the end of the concert, Keith has resolved his struggles with the piano or with whatever, and there comes a kind of an overcoming and a transcendence.
So built into this conversation, both from you, Dan, and from you, Vincent. Dan, you talk about how the music is a bit simpler. If maybe there's a distinction in this recording, the music had to be simplified compared to some of the other concerts of the era because of the limitations of the piano. And, you know, you also said limitations are often useful when trying to, especially with totally freeform improvisation, to try to set some constraints can help you. As a matter of fact, Dan, I think some of your work in technology, algorithmic work, has been designed to impose certain kinds of limitations within which you can then explore. And Vincent, you know, you're talking about this idea in more emotional terms, about the suffering that you hear, about the struggle that you hear. So if in fact it's true that this piano was problematic, can we draw some conclusion between the problematic instrument and the result? Like maybe a wider audience was able to receive Keith's music because of the limitations, something about quieting him down, settling him down, or focusing it was useful and helpful because it became the best-selling solo piano record of all time. It's one of the most commercially successful jazz records of all time.
The most successful instrumental records of all time. Vincent said that the piano that Keith was playing was supposed to be a Bösendorfer Imperial, but in fact was a smaller model. And he says the piano actually wasn't that bad, but because the sound coming from it was not what the audience was expecting, it created a heightened listening on the part of the audience. And Keith, as we well know, is very sensitive to the level of listening in the audience, and so this created an increased level of exchange and communication between Keith and the audience, and that's one of the things that may have made this recording so good. Would you like a comment from me on that, Leo?
I absolutely would.
Often people say that the piano is terrible that Keith is playing. It's not that bad. I mean, it's like your average jazz club will have a worse piano than this. It's not out of tune. It's just like in dire need of being worked over. It's very tinny sounding. It's just one of those pianos that's like been played too much. It's just that at the level of solo concerts in a concert hall, this would be an embarrassingly bad piano, and you can just hear it clearly. But it's on the scale where you expect a great piano. You expect the best pianos, one of the best pianos in the world. And I think the question you asked, which was, did the piano itself lead Keith to play simpler music? My take, and somebody would have to ask Keith this question directly, but my take is if you have a piano that just doesn't have a particularly beautiful sound and that makes it harder to play lyrical singing melodies, which you hear so much on his other improvisations, the natural thing is to lean in to the nature of the piano as a percussion instrument. Mm-hmm. And Keith is really doing that on this recording. It's one of his most drum-like, one of his most just groove-based. And audiences love a good groove, man. It's just like one of the things that universally speaks to people. And then there's just like less possibility for intricacies of harmony and counterpoint. I mean, there is quite a bit of counterpoint and harmony on the album, but much less so than on the Paris or Vienna concerts. I think it's the Vienna concert where there's a whole movement that's basically like Bach-like 4-part counterpoint. That's just not going to sell quite as well as something that's grooving all the time.
I can add a thing to what you just said. Maybe Dan too, if Leo wants, let's say, a few technical details. It was a piano that had a sustained pedal that was dead, that didn't sound good in the bass, not good in the treble at all. So he was forced to play in the mid-range the whole time. And then above all, you have to imagine the conditions he was arriving in. It's true, he's arriving, and it's the biggest audience of his career so far. I mean, he'd never played in front of that many people before. There were 1,300 people waiting for him. So he arrives, he doesn't have the right piano, he hasn't slept in 2 days. We tell him we might not be able to fix the piano. We somehow managed to fix the piano. And then at the last minute, he says, I don't give a damn about the piano. I'm going to go out there anyway and try to do something crazy. And that is typical of Keith Jarrett and what would come later. It's about forcing yourself to embrace risk, to perform and go where he didn't even think he could go, you know?
Yeah, these are all great points from Vincent. The piano was particularly bad in the treble and the bass and had a problematic sustain pedal. And so Keith had to kind of restrict himself to the mid-register. And this was actually a special period, a special moment in Keith's career because it was the first time he was playing for an audience of that size as a solo pianist, 1,300 people. And, there was all this discussion during the day about whether the concert was going to happen or wasn't going to happen. And at the very last minute, he decides to risk it all, say, I don't care about the piano, I'm just going to try to make music. And that's very typical of Keith's personality and what we'll see more as he makes more and more music, which is just a true taste for risk. And that's one of the things we hear in this concert is just the feeling of risk-taking.
And he's also sleep deprived. This is part of the background as well. He hasn't slept. He's been stressed on tour. I have to say, though, as we learn in your documentary, Vincent, the piano, as you say, was not the imperial that he wanted, but it wasn't the 6-foot practice piano that Vera Brandes has described for so many years. Keith has spoken very little about this concert. And so all of the mythology that we have, including the real condition of the piano, is not entirely verified. We have Vera Brandes, who clearly, and I spoke to her last year and I hold her in high esteem, has suffered from the same ailment that we all suffer from, which is when we tell a story over and over again, the story changes. And we're talking about a story that she started telling as a teenager 50 years ago and has expanded into the realm of mythology over the years. And I wonder, are we certain that the piano really was as broken down in the upper register and the lower register, and was the sustain pedal really as bad as we believe it was? Dan, you say you can hear that it's not a great piano, but I left your film wondering, was the piano really as damaged as we say it was, or is that part of this expanding, maybe mistaken memory?
Yeah, I won't reveal one of the film's key elements because that would be a shame. I see what you're getting at, Leo. But no, what I can tell you for sure is that yes, they certainly did make some changes. The piano was very, very badly out of tune. They probably changed a few strings, and that's probably the extent of it. What we learned quite quickly was that the piano, in any case, was good and playable, and was also a Busendorfer. So it wasn't a piano that was all that bad. It wasn't the piano Keith was expecting. It's not a piano that would be used for this kind of performance and this kind of concert, for a solo concert for such an artist at that time. But no, what I can also tell you is that Vera, she told us some things at one point, since you were talking about Vera Brandes. And in fact, we very quickly realized that we were battling an enemy to make this documentary, and that enemy is memory, because it was a story that was already 50 years old. And Vera, as you mentioned, was extremely young. She was barely 19 years old at that time.
And so I think she was in such a state of stress, she doesn't even remember the piano size or anything. When Keith Jarrett said, I won't play, she thought, but I must find another piano. And that was it.
And honestly, the piano size, she didn't care about it at all, I think. She just wanted the concert to happen.
And, well, that's it. They managed to handle it. But no, the piano wasn't that bad. It wasn't so bad. I think it was a lot of elements that made Keith Jarrett, with his fatigue, with his back pain, made him not want to play. And especially, I think they were quite disconcerted to see that such a small woman, who was Vera, had organized such a big concert. And they see this tiny woman, this mere slip of a girl, come onto the stage and tell them, no, everything's ready. But then the right piano isn't there. They must have been hallucinating, guys. They must have been shocked to see a young girl, barely an adult, organizing a concert like that. And I think it's more that it's the amateurism they saw in Vera's eyes, who wasn't an amateur at the time, though, because she had already performed concerts that perhaps scared them. I might have gone on a bit then.
So Vincent said that he doesn't want to give away the secret that he reveals in the documentary, but the piano was not, in fact, that bad. And that possibly Keith's reaction of wanting to cancel the concert had something to do with Vera Brandes' inexperience and youth. that they arrived sleep deprived, and that they were really surprised that such a small woman, as Vincent put it, could be organizing such a big concert. Yeah. I just like to make one comment, which is, as a very experienced professional pianist, I can tell you exactly the state of that piano. There are no mechanical problems with that piano. It is just a badly voiced, overplayed, not great piano. That's all, which is just, as I'm saying, on the scale of what is expected at that level, it's really low. On the scale of what is expected to make music on, it's not that bad. Plenty of music can be made, as we can hear. But it's going to be, like if I showed up for a concert in front of 1,300 people to play the Goldberg variations on that, or to play duo with Lee Konitz, as I did many times, I'd be like, dude, like, this is not appropriate. We need to do something on the piano. Are there any other possibilities? Do we have time to bring another one in? This has actually happened to me, by the way. I can think of one example. I was in Spain. I did a concert of Goldberg variations years ago in a festival, and I arrived. I always try to arrive early for this kind of situation and meet the piano tuner in case there's something to fix. And the piano was just not that great. And the organizers said, there's actually a piano shop right next door. Maybe we can see if we can get another piano. So I went to the piano shop. They had way better pianos there. And we brought in a concert grand, and it made the concert better, substantially better. So this is not like an uncommon problem. But it's not a terrible piano. It's a piano that works. It's just not great.
This is part of why I wanted to have you in this conversation, Dan, because I think that there are multiple factors at play here. There is the reality of a musician on tour who, as you say, in most jazz clubs would be met with a far inferior piano, or at least a similar kind of piano, or whatever can happen. And then there's all of this outside conversation, and once the music sort of enters the world, enters the zeitgeist, enters the stream of conversation, it's no longer necessarily about the reality or the specifics of what happened on stage. It's about what it represents in the world. And now, in the space of 2 years, Vincent, there are 2 films that have been made about this concert. There's this narrative film that was made last year that is oriented around Vera Brandis's personal experience. And now there's this documentary film about the concert that is as much about your search, Vincent, as it is about the concert. It is about your search and discovery for what happened. And to be honest, neither one of these is about Keith. Mm-hmm. It's not about even so much about the music. Part of this is because in both cases, ECM and Keith have not allowed the music to be used in these films. So you have to speak about it and demonstrate it and tell the story without actually dealing with the music. But I just think it is interesting that this is now the second in 2 years or 3 years, films that look at this concert without really dealing with the person at the center of the concert, who is Keith. If there's a question here, it's who is this film about? Or what is this film about?
Actually, it's quite simple. Keith Jarrett always wanted us to listen more to his music than to him or what he had to say about music. And ECM is the same. They are people whose only ambition is to talk about music and to make music.
And if we've truly listened to Keith Jarrett's music, and if we've really grasped his constant drive to improvise, to be that instrument perhaps between what some might call God and the audience, then he is merely a bridge, a conduit between the inspiration, its source, and what he is meant to convey.
I believe that what Keith Jarrett wants to show us in his music is above all a philosophy of life. And this film, the film I made about him, at least, that's what I tried to convey to people, is that Keith Jarrett's music goes far beyond just simple music. It speaks of philosophy, and it speaks of a teaching that we must instill in ourselves through and thanks to improvisation. And this is precisely what this film is about. It's about stepping off the beaten path, getting out of your comfort zone to truly find yourself.
Very present in Keith's interviews and things like that is that he wants to be known through his music and not through his person or his words about the music. The music speaks for itself, and that's also the attitude of ECM. Secondly, to Vincent, the Köln Concert and Keith's music in general is not just about music. It is really about philosophy, and a specific philosophy of life, which is actually the subject of his film. So what is the philosophy that Keith is putting forward in his music? And it is to Vincent a philosophy about improvisation. It's a philosophy about getting outside of one's comfort zone, taking risks, and exposing oneself to life.
Vincent, in making this film, did you feel that you were engaging in that same philosophical approach, or at least trying to approximate the Keith Jarrett philosophy in the way you made the film?
Ça serait prétentieux de dire que j'ai approché la même philosophie de Keith Jarrett. J'ai commencé certainement à découvrir ma propre philosophie. Et c'est ça qui est important. Et c'est ça l'enseignement de la musique de Keith Jarrett.
Saying it'd be pretentious to say that he was able himself to take on Keith Jarrett's philosophy, but what he was able to do was discover his own philosophy. And that is really the lesson of Keith's music.
How would you describe your own philosophy?
Simple.
Listen to the child, and the listen to the child that we must remain, meaning not letting the child we are die. I think that's what's most important. And the film you'll also see at the end of the film, there's this little anecdote to explain a little bit about Keith Jarrett's philosophy, and certainly an entry into the mystery of this film, which is my answer. Well, which could be one of the answers. And I think that what Jarrett has always done is not let the child he was die, always listen to that child who was deep inside him. And I believe that. I think that's really it. I'm also trying to pass something on to my daughter to show her that you should never give up on your dreams. And I think that's the greatest lesson you can give your children. You know, it seems very simple, but it's so obvious, really.
Ça paraît très simple, mais c'est tellement évident en fait. Mais il faut le faire.
His philosophy is, above all, to remain a child at heart and to not let the child inside die. And he has been trying to communicate these ideas to his daughter.
Dan, what do you think about the role of this kind of mythology or these legends in the music? As you're listening to this whole conversation, what do you make of it?
Let me tell you a story. I went to the New England Conservatory for my master's in music, and a few years before I left, Paul Bley was still teaching there. Paul Bley, who, by the way, was a big influence on Keith Jarrett. And I had several friends who had taken lessons with Paul Bley. And the lessons usually consisted of going to a coffee shop nearby and just talking. And one of the things he would say semi-regularly to his students as they would arrive, and he would say, "What have you done for your legend today?" I have another joke that I like to make, which is jazz musicians used to wear sunglasses indoors in order to hide their bloodshot eyes caused by taking heroin. And jazz musicians now wear sunglasses indoors to hide the fact that their eyes are not bloodshot because they're not taking heroin. There's just always some element of myth making, but it really depends on musicians. Like, one of the things that I've realized for myself is I value sincerity above all. And I hear a huge amount of sincerity in Keith's music. But I don't always hear sincerity in his speech. I think he's aware of the necessity for myth. Like, he almost never answers technical or factual questions directly. There's always like some kind of like, I feel like he's aware of the necessity to not break the myth. And maybe it also just goes along with his desire to let the music speak for itself, right? Like, the more you explicate the music, the less room you leave for the audience to find their own meaning in the music. So I think it's perfectly defensible to be there. But it just varies enormously from musician to musician, and also among artists. I mean, somebody like Picasso was or Dali was like a huge self-mythologizer. And then, you know, you have someone like MC Escher, who just was a very straightforward man. And both of them made great art that had a huge impact on their times. And I think it's all fine. But somebody like Keith, I think, has contributed to his own mythology, probably quite purposefully. Like, I actually wonder sometimes if the antics on stage are conscious. Because you have to remember, Keith is adherent to the fourth way, right? The Gurdjieff philosophy. if there's one thing about the Gurdjieff philosophy is that it's about intentionality in absolutely everything you do. So either he's a very bad subscriber to that philosophy, or he's conscious that by doing occasional antics on stage, this creates mythology, this creates attention. I mean, it's amazing to me how much time is spent by audiences and by musicians themselves discussing, what's the last thing that Keith did at his concert, how did he insult his audience exactly, like all this stuff. So it's very effective, everything he's done in that department. And, we'd have to ask Keith himself, or just not ask him and let the mythology continue. But I would say he's somebody who's very aware of what he's doing in that department.
Vincent, for you, what do you think is the value or the importance of mythology around music and musicians as a fan?
Your true self to become part of the mythology. We know that all the fairy tales and legends told to us when we were very young, like Tom Thumb or similar stories, were also meant to help us grow and to project ourselves into the future and into certain challenges we would face throughout our lives. And I believe mythology serves that purpose. At least that's how I see it. And for a musician, if I've understood the question correctly, Dan, I'm not going off on a tangent. Am I?
That the role of mythology in general, if you look at other types of myths that are told, and in particular fairy tales, the role of fairy tales is to allow the reader, and in particular a child, to project themselves into the future, to insert themselves into the mythology and see how they would act in the future. He said that for a musician, the mythology of somebody like Keith Jarrett could be crushing, as in it feels very imposing, and that musicians who come up under that need to find a way to insert themselves into that mythology, or to create their own mythology.
I guess the question, not only the concert, but understanding that the mythology is maybe separate from the music. The music exists and the mythology exists, and the mythology is not crushing. Like you say, Keith Jarrett can be overwhelming for another musician. It could be scary to try to insert yourself into the same narrative. But when music fans talk about the story of their favorite record, they're not only talking about the music, they're talking about each other. They're talking about their own individual personal search, and also about their own love, their own hearts, their own emotional realities. In your film, you talk to a number of people who are engaged in some form of conversation with this mythology. How does that help connect people independent of the music?
It is certainly true that when we traveled all across the continent of Europe to find this piano, it was quite unlike anything that we have ever encountered. I couldn't have imagined it. Doors opened very, very quickly, because indeed we were talking about a cult classic, the Köln Concert. As soon as I picked up the phone to ask, would you have something to say about the Köln Concert, Keith Jarrett, and what it meant to you, etc., not a single door was closed to me. Every single one of the doors swung wide open. The Köln Concert is an album that many people have listened to him, whom many jazz musicians sometimes deny having listened to. Raphael Imbert, whom I interviewed, is a staunch defender of Keith Jarrett, but he tells me that plenty of his friends who are jazz musicians and who love jazz, etc., say no, but that's not the Köln Concert and Keith Jarrett is not jazz. Anyway, there's still a dichotomy between the two, but the Köln Concert often serves as a neutral ground, and everyone agrees on that, saying yes, something really did happen there. And so, yes, we would all get together and talk about it for hours. And no matter how thoroughly we dissected the myth, we all inevitably arrived at the exact same conclusion, that this particular album it really ended up changing our lives a little bit. That is something that is certainly for sure, to varying degrees, but this album has changed every one of our lives. That much is clear.
So Vincent said that in the course of making the documentary, he was surprised to find that there was so much interest and love for the Köln Concert as an album that when he made phone calls trying to track down the piano and inquiring about what people knew about it, people were very open to discussing it, and doors were open to him. Furthermore, it is an album that jazz musicians are quite divided on. He interviewed Raphael Imbert, the French jazz musician, who himself was very positive about it, but said that some of his colleagues and friends don't appreciate the album and judge it to not be jazz, which editor's note I think is just like such a silly thing to even begin to think about saying. And lastly, that one thing everybody was in agreement on is that this album had somehow or another changed their lives.
Do you think that this concert, if it were performed today and recorded today, would have the same impact that it had being recorded 50 years ago?
Absolutely, yes.
Well, I think this is where the question of mythology really comes in, because mythology, we tend to think of it as this kind of fake, made-up thing. But in the case of Keith, there's something very real to it, which is that at the time that he was doing this, I think it was truly innovative to get up on stage without any idea of what you were going to do and go to this level of depth of exploration in long form. Obviously, the idea of free improvisation long preceded this. Also, people had been doing improvised solo concerts. But Keith was somebody who just had unbelievable levels of talent and craft and spiritual commitment and focus. And for him, and also had a big following already. Like people were very excited about him as a musician. So for him to get up on stage and say, I'm going to do this pretty radical thing for kind of the first time, or at least for the first time for a lot of his audience, is a moment that is true mythology in the sense that looking back on it historically, this is a moment in time that has true significance and that will be part of the mythology of our times because it's part of the history of our times. Now, you do that today, imagining that Keith has already done all the stuff he's done, no way does it have the same mythological significance. It's still going to be great music and people are still going to be blown away by it. But also something else. The music of the Köln Concert is very specific to its times. It's basically a fusion of Americana kind of country music with jazz, more or less, or at least like, let's say the African-American tradition of settling into a groove and just like luxuriating in that groove for a while, blowing over the changes. It's a particular melding of elements that were very present at that time. And so if you did that today, it would be kind of anachronistic in the same way that playing the Köln Concert today is anachronistic. So there's a wave of the present at that moment in time, and Keith is just riding it so beautifully perched on top of the wave. And it just wouldn't be the same today. Would it be successful? Probably, because it's genius, but it's a completely different moment, and it would have a completely different impact.
I mean, I think it's a common conversation about so much great work that it often exists in its context and independent of its context. And if it really works, it can work in both ways. Like, it is so specific to its time, and yet it transcends its time. There is a moment in the film, Vincent, I know I'm giving away a lot of your film, and so forgive me, but there is a moment in your film where you listen to a recording that had never been released.
Yeah.
Of, I don't know if it's the night before or a few nights before in the same tour.
The night before.
The night before. You say, I feel like I'm listening to the beginning of the Koln Concert.
Yeah.
The first draft of the Koln Concert. And I really appreciated that moment because I think we believe that these things happen completely in a vacuum, independent of anything that came before or anything that came after. And clearly what Keith played in that other concert was very different. But you can hear the ideas that he was thinking about and some of the way he was approaching it.
Indeed, it was quite a wonderful moment because to understand how an artist works, what we also wanted to show people is that actually his music during a tour of several concerts, he starts with the first concert, then he will improve as if he were repeating a mantra or things he discovers little by little. Actually, it really helps people to understand that in an artist's mind there is no such thing as starting from scratch. Being an artist means always being open to what has happened, to the present moment and to the future as well. So in reality, you simply cannot separate those three things. And that's what we wanted to show people, that actually, yes, he's a superhero in a way, but at the same time, it also shows the extraordinary ability to reinvent oneself every day. And that's what was extraordinary about the Köln concert. And you can feel that he certainly, with what he had done before at the beginning of his tour, had brought out the best of what he had already anticipated of his little tricks, of his scales, etc. And there you go. But no, actually, yes, it was a truly extraordinary moment, because that tape, it only came out once, and I had the feeling of walking into a rehearsal of the Köln concert.
Vincent was saying that in the process of hearing this tape from the previous night, he realized that there is no real notion of doing something from scratch in an artist, and that everything is always impregnated of the past, the present, and the future, and that there's no other way than that approach, and that the genius of the Köln concert is the possibility of reinventing oneself, but without completely reinventing oneself. Can I make a small comment about this?
Please do.
So, as you know, I toured for 12 years with Lee Konitz, and one of the things that happened with Lee Konitz is we'd play some of the same tunes every night. Literally every concert we played All the Things You Are, for example. I think, and I counted the concerts I did with him at his death, because a journalist asked me how many we'd done, and it was over 150. And one of the things I learned, and that Lee talked about, is it is just as much a trap to say to yourself, I must not play what I played last night, as it is to say, I should play exactly what I played last night. Like, the only real way of being is to be in the present, which means to do whatever you genuinely feel like doing at that moment, unburdened by what you just did the night before, whether it is similar or different. And so it would be completely natural for Keith in this context to be re-exploring some ideas he explored the night before.
I'm glad that you brought up Lee Konitz, because when I was asking you about the role of mythology, mythology operates on a lot of different levels, but throughout the rest of your life, Dan, part of your formation will always be these years that you spent with Lee, who was an icon, who was a bridge to a previous generation, the birth of the music in so many ways. And it inserts you into a kind of version of the mythology of the music. You know, you enter it whether or not you intend. You may just enter it because you play music or whatever, but like, that was part of what I was thinking about when I was talking to you about what your take on these kinds of stories are, or the extra musical conversation around the music, because, you know, you spent all this time with a kind of iconic figure in the music, and I'm sure you have great anecdotes about him personally and otherwise that aren't only about the music, they're about the worldview and the philosophy and the point of view and just the way he was. These stories get passed around like trading cards, you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, here I think we enter again into the subtle difference between history and myth, right? And I think myth does have an element of, I guess, what we'd call like self-mythologizing or whatever, which would be like a performative, deliberate attempt at creating a kind of a myth around oneself. And I think there are many artists who do that. Some of them very explicitly, like, you know, you look at somebody like Prince, for example, it's very clearly that he masterfully engaged in that. And again, Dali, like to an extreme degree.
Miles.
Yeah, Miles, I'm less certain of it with Miles. I don't have a clear take. Miles could also just be incredibly truthful. I don't know how much mythologizing there is in his autobiography, for example. Like, it feels very sincere to me. Whereas I do see self-mythologizing in Keith, very much so. I never saw any self-mythologizing in Lee. I think he was incredibly sincere at every turn, to the point where he pissed people off, because he would say exactly what he thought of them or of whatever. And that in turn strikes people and is memorable to people, negatively or positively. And as a result, there becomes a kind of a mythology around him that is just history, because it's the truth of what occurred. And I really think Lee, I mean, I knew him very well. I don't think there was ever any attempt at creating something that wasn't there. I think he was just, that's the way he was. And I think it's how he was born too, because I knew people who knew him when he was like 19 and they're like, yeah, he's always been that way. You know, just want to make that slight difference between history
Yes.
and myth.
Yes.
Of course, history gets mythologized. As we were saying, one of the things Vincent said earlier, I thought that was really cool, is that he said in his documentary, one of his greatest battles was the battle with memory, in particular when he was interviewing Vera Brandes. And as you said, Leo, we all have this thing where we start to believe the stories we tell over and over again. And that happens societally too, right? So even truth gets mythologized.
Yes, I think that's what I'm so drawn to here. Vincent and Dan, this has been a true experience, and it also will become part of my own personal mythology.
I can't wait to see this film, Vincent.
Yeah, of course. Maybe if you came in Europe, or if you will come maybe in UK in November or October.
Okay. Well, we'll talk.
I can tell you that it's playing in New York on May 2nd at the Roxy Cinema as part of the Rock and Roll Film Festival. Vincent, I'll see you there. Thank you so much for taking time with me. And
Thanks a lot, Leo.
Congratulations.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, pleasure to meet you, Vincent.
Thanks.
Okay,
thanks
be
for
well.
including me, Leo.
Dan, thank you so much for agreeing to
Yeah, thanks so much.